Okay, good morning to everybody. Good morning to everybody who's on the live Zoom link this morning. And welcome to everybody who's joining it from whenever and wherever you're viewing this. I guess that's the beauty of the live Zoom link. I'm going to talk about what we're going to do today and where we stand in the class. We're pretty much right on track with what my sort of forecasted schedule is. And that is we're going to talk about the rest of chapter 6 today, and it deals with national income accounting, and I'll sort of back up just a little bit in order to go forward on that. And before the end of the class session, we'll start to get into chapter 8, which deals in the text, which deals with unemployment. And unemployment is always an important topic to talk about. In fact, the next 2 chapters that are coming up, and if I don't get through chapter 8 today, which is entirely possible, then I don't see the need to push and run at light speed in order just to cover it. I'd rather give it the time that it requires. But if we don't get through it all, we'll certainly pick it up next time. But these next 2 chapters, chapters 8 and 9, really deal with what economists consider to be the 2 biggest macro problems that may exist. And they usually don't exist at the same time. Usually they're on different parts of the business cycle. Unemployment being on the downside of the business cycle when you've got a recession. Recessions, again, characterized by downturns in economic activity, that is in GDP. And so when the economy slows down, obviously people lose jobs, and also capital goods are not being employed to the fullest of their capability. And so productively, the economy is inefficient from that standpoint. And unemployment is considered to be in a state of inefficiency, which is why there's so much effort put into combating it. On the other side of the business cycle is inflation, which is a really one of the biggest, hottest, maybe the hottest topic right now in macroeconomics, simply because of the fact that we now have inflation really in a significant way for the first time in 40 years, really. And I know that probably this, for most of the class members here, this may be your first experience with inflation that exceeds, say, 3%. And that's not your fault. You are the beneficiary of a pretty good stable price environment for a very long time. I can remember the last time, and frankly, it's been so long, I think I was in school the last time we had inflation above 5%. But we got a very hot inflation number just yesterday. And which is, so inflation for January, if you annualized it, would come out to about 7% annually, which is really, really high, considering the fact that for years and years, our federal government was trying to get inflation up to all the way to 2%, which is obviously far less than where it is now. So inflation is a burning topic. So different ends of the business cycle, and we are running a very, very hot business cycle. Unemployment is very low at the moment. Inflation is very high. So then the question becomes what to do about it. And so this is pretty, this is maybe a pretty interesting time to be taking a macro class if you're interested in the economy. And if you're not, well, then I guess it's never a good time to take a macro course. But this is an interesting time, and I say that with all, in all honesty, because there are times in which there's not much going on in macro. The economy is growing okay, and there's not much inflation, and so we're talking about inflation and unemployment as being mostly historical artifacts, and there's not much to point to in current events in order to really give light on what's happening. So it is an interesting time, and we'll be covering some of this in some more detail. But before we do that, we'll pick up on the rest of chapter 6. Also, I posted the video for Tuesday's class just yesterday. I tried to get those done on the same day. I was unable to get back to campus in order to do that on Tuesday. I was in a meeting and I just got stuck, and I don't have a key to this building. In fact, there aren't many people running around here at night anyway. And so it took me until yesterday, so I apologize for the delay in posting that video. Hopefully that doesn't represent too much of a hardship. I'll try to get today's posted sometime this evening. That's my hope. I just can't do it the same day, usually because there are just classes coming in right after this, and I've got to do it. I've got to do the uplink on this computer. Okay. Also, and if I forget to do this, and this is something you request, and you're watching the live Zoom link, and you want me to do the live transcription, I try to remember to enable it so that you can read with closed captioning what I'm saying. I think I've enabled it here. it's hard for me to see whether or not you can actually see this. So if you want to see that, just let me know. Just raise your hand, do the virtual hand raise, or put something in the chat box. I will see it. And the fact that I'm looking over here all the time is I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying to be mindful of the fact that I've got a live class, but you're not there. You're right there, so I'm going to see you that way. Okay. All right. So questions for me about anything? One other thing I should talk about. I've got a couple pending matters with a couple of you regarding the exam, and I am looking into this because a couple of people had some difficulties. Well, a couple that I've heard from, and maybe there were more and I haven't heard from, difficulties in viewing some of the graphs. And in these cases, I asked what kind of device you're using. I may have mentioned this on Tuesday, I don't recall. Because I was kind of concerned that maybe people were trying to do it on cell phones. My experience is that exam taking on cell phones doesn't work that well. I've had more difficulty with those kind of devices being used than computers. If laptop is fine, it's a computer. I don't know about tablets so much, and I don't know about cell phones so much, and so that's why I ask. But I think in most cases, students were using computers. So I've got to find out what's happening. I'm still looking into it. I haven't dropped the ball. I will get back to you, hopefully today. I hope to have some sort of resolution on this. I have an idea what happened, but I don't know. I think I know what happened. I just don't know why it happened. And so I'll try to get with you. And if I don't, for whatever reason, then get with me over the weekend, and I'll be more than glad to deal with that. So, okay. All right. So I don't see any questions for me. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed here. We're going to pick up chapter 6. Chapter 6 is really this chapter that sort of is our intro to the rest of the course, which is all macro all the time. And deals with what's called national income accounting and the accounts, which you will see if you ever go to the BEA website, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They're sometimes called the national accounts. They're sometimes called the NIPA accounts, NIPA, National Income and Product Accounts. Those are what they're formally known as. We simply call the activity national income accounting. And there are really two methods. There are actually three, but we're only going to cover the two main ones because they're easier to sort of deal with. There are two methods of computing GDP. Again, we define GDP as being this big, all-encompassing number that captures all economic activity in the economy to the extent that we can. And I'm going to talk about cases in which we cannot capture that activity. But if you could just imagine if you had some giant supercomputer somewhere that captured every economic activity that happened, every time you go to work and clock in and clock out, every time you buy a pack of gum or buy gas or pay your rent, if you had something that would tabulate it all, you would end up at the end of some time period with a GDP figure. Well, we don't have that. We're getting closer and closer to that. And who knows, maybe one day we will have that, particularly as we move to sort of a cashless economy. We may get to that point at some point. But we're not there yet, and we may not be there anytime soon for reasons that I'll talk about here in a minute. So there are two approaches. One is the first one we are practically done talking about. That's the expenditures approach. That views this from the demand side of the macroeconomy. That is, who's doing the spending. And then the other approach is what we'll talk about here in a bit. And that's the income approach. And that's from the supply side. And that's who's doing the supplying. And we call it the income approach because if you're supplying something, well, then you're being compensated with income. And if you are supplying something, you're not being compensated with income, then it's not really economic activity because it doesn't really count. If you build something and nobody buys it, well, then that's not really being accounted for somehow in economic activity. Okay, so that's where we are, and let's pick it up from there. And I just want to go back to real briefly, and I don't want to spend too much time covering the expenditures approach, but it really is the one that I think we probably look to more than the other over time, just simply because of the fact that it's a lot of times easier to sort of visualize economic activity from the standpoint of demand and who's doing the buying, and it's easy to see the actors' roles and all that. So when we talk about the expenditures approach, what are we talking about? We're talking about GDP, which again, GDP is also known as the capital letter Y, and we have these four terms: C plus I plus G plus the difference between the term, which is the difference between these two values, X and M. Okay, C plus I plus G plus X sub N, X minus M. And sometimes this term itself will be called NX or X sub N or whatever. It stands for net exports, and I'm going to get to that here shortly. That's where we did not get to on Tuesday. So when we talk about consumption, we're talking about what is known in the national income accounts as personal consumption expenditures. And I'll sort of summarize the importance of consumption to the rest of these here before we move on to the income approach. And it really deals with consumer spending, that is ordinary household spending, on really three categories of item. That is durable goods, goods which are expected to last 3 years or longer. They include things like houses, or no, I'm sorry, not houses, no, not houses, cars and boats and furniture and appliances and electronics, those kinds of things, those kind of big ticket items. I can't believe I said houses because that is not one of those that go into it. If it's new construction, it will actually go here. And if it's existing, it's an existing home that it was accounted for in GDP, whenever it was built. Okay, so that's consumption, personal consumption expenditures. Second is investment, which is gross private domestic investment. We said that had three categories itself, and that was fixed investment, which is spending by businesses on things like the capital category that we talked about earlier, under the factors of production, things like machinery and equipment, things which are unique to a business that are, it's sort of durable spending for a business. Things like computer technology, a computer that a business would use. So if a computer bought a business bought a computer, it would go under I. I guess I should move this under the I here. If a business bought a computer, it would go under I. If you bought a computer for your home use, it would be part of C. So it's for business use. But there's also what is probably more more obvious are the goods which are clearly intended for business use. Something like, what was the example? Something like a forklift or cranes or conveyor belts, right? These are not things that households would buy for really any purpose, okay? So gross private domestic investment. The next one was government expenditures. And we talked about the fact that there was federal and state spending. One of the things that I highlighted with federal spending was that we basically break federal spending into two categories: defense spending and non-defense spending. And this is probably something that's more unique to the United States. A lot of the views of the macroeconomy that we'll be doing, even including things like the circular flow model, the production possibilities model, could be easily transferred to some other economy like Canada or France or Switzerland or whatever. But defense is something that's somewhat unique to the United States because we have such a large expenditure on defense spending, and that's apparently the public will, is that we want to have a large defense expenditure. And it obviously was not without controversy, because some feel and have felt for a very long time that maybe some of those resources could be diverted elsewhere. And the support for that argument tends to gain traction, particularly in the 1990s, when the so-called Cold War with the former Soviet Union was over, basically, and the U.S. started closing bases, military bases all over the place. And in the 1990s were a boom years for the economy. So those who sort of are skeptical of the what they view as excessive spending on defense will point to those years as evidence of the fact that redeployment of our resources would be a good thing for all of us. But again, that then things happen where it does seem like defense spending there's a requirement for it to increase. So anyway, there's no right or wrong answer. It's one of those normative judgments that so what should be that it's going to differ depending upon who has the particular point of view. This is why we elect politicians with various views, and that's how the whole political process works. We also talked about state government being primarily involved with law enforcement and public education, infrastructure like streets and all that. Then the final category here is C, the C plus I plus G is net exports, which is this. X is simply the value for exports. Exports are defined as goods sold to foreign buyers. Imports are goods purchased from foreign sellers. And so here's the thing with net exports that's interesting. This is when we talked about this on Tuesday, we said that if we had a simple calculation where all the spending in the economy, remember this is from the demand side, if all it was C for household spending, I for business spending, and G for government spending, we would have essentially a closed economy. That is, nothing comes in, nothing leaves from abroad. That is, we're like a little island. Nothing comes in, nothing leaves. Nobody comes in, nobody leaves. And when I say nobody, I'm talking about no labor coming in, no labor leaving, no money flowing in, no money flowing out. So you're an isolated economy. Well, today there really are very few, only just a small handful that we know of that are truly closed economies. And they've got to be very, very isolated geographically. Mostly island states, I think, we'd be talking about. And I think that those are probably getting fewer and fewer all the time. So trade with the rest of the world is a reality. There are a lot of reasons why trade happens. We talked about this issue of comparative advantage earlier, and that was that nations do better when they trade in things that they're the best at. Even though they may not be the best at anything in the world, they're still better at some things than other things, and they should focus on doing that. And that is really, it's a metaphor, but it's not really even so much, I mean, it's more than a metaphor, it's actually sort of a model for every actor in the economy, including governments, including individuals. Do what you do best and maybe avoid what you do least well if you're in the labor force. So, I mean, we've seen it in cases in which people try to do things which they're not the best at. Doesn't go very well. Michael Jordan stopped playing basketball, of which he was the best in the world, to go play baseball, and that really didn't work out very well for him. So just an idea, something to think about. Maybe don't play baseball if you're the greatest basketball player. But even if you're not the greatest basketball player, or the greatest architect, or the greatest farmer, or whatever, maybe do what you do better than what you do less well. And that's why trade happens. That's why exports and imports happen, is that we can get things from other places. Like we could probably grow sugar in the United States. I would imagine it's probably possible. And there may be places in which we do. I know it's not it can't be that large of a domestic production market, because we import sugar for the most part, and things like bananas. And I have no idea whether we could grow bananas here, but we probably could if we had to. But there are things that we do grow very well here, like tobacco we grow very well, so we export. And U.S. tobacco is considered to be among the best in the world for those who like cigarettes and whatnot. So there are things that we do well that we would specialize in and trade with others, and we buy things from others who do those better and cheaper and faster than ourselves. And so exports and imports. So here's the thing, we need to compare these two because it's X minus M. So think about this, if exports are greater than imports, right, then we have what's known as a trade surplus. So a trade surplus basically is this: if X is greater than M, then this is going to be a positive sign. And remember, this is an equation. So gross domestic product, if we had this giant supercomputer calculating all economic activity, and this was a plus sign, then it would mean that this would go up, right? So trade surplus is a boost to GDP. In other words, GDP would go up, right? So the change in GDP would go up as a result of having a trade surplus. It's a boost to GDP. And the answer for this, as the reason why, just beyond the simple math here, is because think about this. If we are selling more goods to the rest of the world, and this is on a net basis, when I say net, I'm saying there are some goods that we would have a negative situation where we import, for instance, we import more oil than we produce, and certainly more than we export to others. What we do produce, we usually consume here, but we import a heck of a lot more oil than what we export elsewhere, right? But there are other goods that we export a heck of a lot more than what we import, things like motion pictures and entertainment and legal services and medical products and jet aircraft and computer technology. I mean, it's a big list of things which offset each other. So we're talking about how these things offset each other in the big picture here, of all goods taken together. And so if in fact a country has a trade surplus, that is all exports on a net basis, which is why we call this net exports. This term itself is called net exports because it's taking the entire category of goods together. Net just simply means we're just simply taking the aggregate compared against the aggregate. And if we have, if it's a positive, then it means that there's a boost to GDP. And the reason why is simply this, that it means that the rest of the world is financing the output and income of our country to a greater extent than what our domestic buyers are financing the rest of the world's output and production. In other words, this is what's called an injection to the economy. It's a boost to the economy. And there are economies in the world that have deliberately set themselves up as part of their economic policy, usually what's known as something called industrial policy or trade policy, but they've deliberately established a policy whereby they try to get the most exports possible so that they get a boost to their economy. And it raises their national income, it raises household incomes, it raises all kinds of things, simply because of the fact they're an export-driven economy. And there are two economies in the world that really that are very modern and have been engaged in this for decades. Germany is one, Japan is the other. They both have very high export-driven economies, and they have deliberately pursued a strategy of trying to make goods the rest of the world wants to buy. Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong. And you know, and obviously the rest of the world agrees too, because no one's putting a gun to their head saying that you've got to buy Japanese electronics or German machine tools, right? So if the rest of the world likes what you buy, great, and more power to you, and you can benefit from that. Okay, so and increasingly China is one that is an export-driven economy, and China had sort of the benefit of experience that was not their experience, but others' experience, that they were able to observe and say, okay, look, as they left the communist system and became really a truly capitalist system with sort of their politics haven't really caught up with their economics yet, but that's another story. But when they decided to become mostly a free market capitalist state, I think were able to look around the rest of the world and say, what has worked and what has not worked. And one of the things that has worked is to try to be export driven, and they've certainly pursued that to the point where the Chinese economy is the second largest in the world, behind the US, and a lot of it having to do with making goods the rest of the world wants to buy. And there are some other natural advantages. It's the largest population on Earth for one single country. And that's got to be an advantage. Lots and lots of labor power. So no question about that. So this is a trade surplus, it's a boost. What about the other condition, which we've got exports being less than imports? This is a condition known as a trade deficit. Oops, I misspelled deficit there, a trade deficit. Deficit simply meaning it's a negative value, and it's a drag on GDP. It's a drag on GDP. In other words, the change in GDP from this is going to be negative. So what's going to happen is if imports are greater than exports, then you're going to have a negative sign here. So it's going to turn out to be negative. And so sometimes when you see this, and by the way, I know that a lot of people will like to look on other websites like Investopedia, which I don't know that I think is the best for econ. It's probably better if you are a finance course or whatever, but I know that Investopedia is a big one, that you might see something like this, y equals c plus I plus g, and you might see plus or minus, and it might be x sub n, or it might be nx, or it might be xn. I mean, it might be all these kinds of things, but the point is it would be a plus or minus. And so all I'm doing here with the negative sign is simply saying, look, if imports are greater than exports, this is going to be negative. If that's negative, because this is an equation, right, it's going to bring down GDP. And that is for the simple reason that if an economy is buying more goods from foreign sellers than what it's selling to foreign buyers, then it's financing the rest of the world's output to a greater extent than the rest of the world is financing its own output and income on a net basis. Even realizing the fact that you might have certain areas of the economy which you're selling more to others, and yet you're buying more in total. And the US is a good example because this is where we are. This is where the United States has been for the better part of 60 years, and 60 years plus, really. There were a couple of years in the early 90s in which this turned positive, but only very slightly positive. In fact, I don't even think it was for a full 2 years. And it mostly had to do with the first Gulf War after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. and international trade basically came to a standstill for a brief time, and U.S. was not importing as much oil simply because not as much oil was moving through that part of the world, given that particular situation. So that was a very brief period. Where the U.S. is, and simply we, obviously I've said this before, we tend to focus a lot on the U.S. simply because it's a good point of reference. It's, presumably we're all here in this country, even though you don't have to be. We've certainly had our share of international students, which I think is awesome. But any economy, whether it's us or whomever, running a trade deficit is a negative on GDP, and it drags down our GDP. And I know that this is perpetually an issue that has come up, and we hear it probably more from political leaders, elected officials, than we do from anybody else. That elected officials say, we've got this trade deficit, what are we going to do about it? Well, we've had it for quite some time, and it's not going to go away anytime soon, I don't think. And one of the biggest contributors to this happens to be oil and all the fossil fuels that we do import. And we do create increasingly a lot of our own, when I say our, the US does create a lot of its own fossil fuels, oil and natural gas and whatnot. However, a lot of that's used for domestic consumption rather than sending out to the rest of the world. And we still import from a lot of countries. And believe it or not, the one country that we import more oil from than any other is Canada, not Saudi Arabia, which everyone thinks, and everybody thinks of the Middle East when we think of oil. And yes, that's a big producer, but it's a big producer to the world generally. And all the oil in the world, is really priced in US dollars. It's a global market. But for the most part, the oil which we produce is what's known as, which we produce and consume is what's known as West Texas Intermediate. And we consume a lot of what we produce here, and that's still not enough. We still import some, and that's going to continue for some time. I know that environmental economics is a very big area right now. Economics, I know that UNM has a big big environmental economics research focus, and the use of fossil fuels is obviously a big one, because nonetheless it creates a trade deficit for the U.S. economy, or contributes to the trade deficit. It also has detrimental effects on the environment. I don't think there's too much doubt about that at this point, and what to do about it. But I can tell you this, that we're not anywhere close to not using oil, period, because oil is still used. Oil and its byproducts, I should say, are used in so many other products. And so we're not probably going to anytime soon stop producing and consuming oil, even though I think we are probably moving to a point where we will have mostly electric vehicles. And I think that will probably happen in most of our lifetimes. Maybe not my lifetime, but probably my children's lifetime. I feel pretty confident about that. I mean, we're close to now. I mean, the technology exists. It's not experimental, it sort of exists. Okay. All right. So questions about these categories C, I, G, X sub N. All right. Well, one thing I want to do before I move on to the income approach is I want to talk about the relative importance of these to each other. Okay. And to GDP in general. So let's talk about what these are here. And are they created equal? Are we talking about four terms of equal size, and therefore we should be looking at them as equally important and all that? And I think the answer to that is no. And I'll talk about these individually. So when we talk about consumption expenditure throughout the economy, we're talking about a figure which is roughly 2/3 of GDP. It's actually a little more than 2/3. 2/3 would put us about 67%. And during the last recession, which was caused by the economic downturn from housing, it was about 72%, which was a little bit high compared to 2/3. And that was mostly because of the tremendous fall off in I, mostly because of new construction having just come to a standstill, particularly residential construction. Those of us who remember what happened in 2007, 2008, basically the housing industry got its knees cut out from under it. Lots of problems and a lot of it had to do with financing, frankly. Mortgage financing that just simply was not well done. And so as a result, we had lots of difficulties in that regard. So, but for the most part, traditionally and historically, 2/3 of GDP, which means so about $2 of every $3 that are spent in the economy is spent somewhere by households on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Remember, we talked about services as being those things which are non-inventoriable. So the three categories: durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Services are a big category of that as well. And so it's a pretty big portion of overall spending in the economy. And I know that there sometimes is a tendency to believe that, well, the economy is dominated by the big players, the big corporations and whatnot. And so therefore government is going to focus their attention on making sure that they're taken care of. And I'm not saying that there isn't some merit to that particular point of view. However, given the fact that 2/3 of every dollar that is spent somewhere in the economy is spent by households, it would be imprudent, I think, on the part of government to ignore households. And in fact, a lot of the attention of government budget and priorities is on households. We have a tremendous amount of expenditure that supports households in things like housing assistance and things like Medicaid, education, support for public education, support for transportation. President Biden has probably been as active as any president at trying to really improve the fortunes of households through trying to through tax measures like expanding the child tax credit, which is a very significant tax credit for parents with children, and other measures as well. So some of which he's having trouble getting through, some of which he's already gotten through and has been successful in that regard. So the household is important. It's an important part of the economy. So that's so important. Now, what about this though in relation to the others? Here's the good news about consumption. You might think, okay, well, it's 2/3 of the economy and households are all over the place. And so as a result, GDP can fluctuate wildly, but that's not the case. We talk about spending in the economy. We're saying consumer spending is very stable. And that's good news, given that 2/3 of GDP from the spending side is very stable. And it may not seem that way, but consider the fact that, since the Great Depression, really, we have not had too many periods of extremely high unemployment. We had a time in the early 80s in which unemployment got above 10% for a couple of years. It was a pretty deep and prolonged recession. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about policy, because I think a lot of that is due to probably over stringent monetary policy. We'll save that discussion for a bit later. And then we got a little bit above 10% just for a very brief time in 2008 when that recession was really biting. But that went down pretty quickly, and then that was on a very long, slow decline. That was a very slow recovery out of that particular recession. It took years, actually. But the point is, though, that spending was relatively stable, mostly because there was a lot of support for the consumer when the economy is weakened. If people lose their jobs, there's unemployment assistance, which, yes, I know it does not cover dollar for dollar lost wages, but it does help support a household, so the household doesn't go all the way to zero with spending, and there is income support. Also, households are able to borrow in many cases, and there are other forms of assistance as well: food assistance, medical assistance, housing assistance, things like that that could help to cushion the blow in these instances in which there is economic stress happening. Okay, so households there to support, and then when the economy is going great, people will tend to support the economy through spending. So as a result, this is a fairly stable part of the economy, and this is good news, because if this is 2/3 of spending and this is relatively stable, then that means the GDP is relatively stable, and it really pretty much is. And that's good news. And it may differ from some people's point of view that it is the economy is wildly out of control and just unpredictable and all of that. And I don't think that's really our experience. Not since the Great Depression, at least. Only in rare instances have we been in some really strange circumstances. We're in pretty uncharted waters now with the pandemic, and nobody knows when it's going to end. And I think a lot of the uncertainty, and certainly a lot of the labor force uncertainty, I'm talking about the supply of labor. A lot of people are reluctant to go to work. or go back to work or be in jobs where there's contact with others because they don't know what, where this thing ends. I saw an article in the New York Times over the weekend, last weekend, that the closest example that we have in our history is the flu epidemic of 1918, and which everyone refers to the year 1918, but this article went on to say that it lasted well beyond 1918. In fact, 1920 was even worse. It was the same bug. They didn't have any vaccines in those days. And parts of the country like New York and Detroit are the two areas they said were just absolutely flattened by it, and it killed many, many, many Americans, a larger proportion of the population than what COVID has done. But we know more about vaccines and whatnot. The point I want to make, though, is the fact that it could be another year, another 2 years. I don't know. I don't think anybody, I really don't think anyone knows, to be real honest with you. So, yes, there is uncertainty because of this. And this is a little bit new territory. But for the most part, I think our experience shows that GDP is relatively stable and households have relatively stable behavior. Okay. All right. What about I? I can't give you a ratio of I because it's not particularly well known. It doesn't follow any particular habit. And the reason why is it is very volatile. It is very volatile. And the reason it's very volatile is because of this. The big I here, which is investment, is tied to the little I, which is the interest rate. So when we talk about all of these elements of spending that go into GPDI, it is gross private domestic investment, they're all interest sensitive. And when we simply define interest or the interest rate as the rental cost of money, that's a very wonky sort of definition, but that's what it is. It's the rental cost of money. So what does it cost me to borrow money from somebody else? In other words, anytime I acquire money from somebody in borrowing, I'm acquiring someone else's savings, and I'm compensating them usually indirectly. I'm usually not going directly to the saver. I'll go through an intermediary like a bank or a mortgage company or whatever, credit card company, and I will borrow the money and I'll pay a cost. And it's an interest rate, obviously expressed in terms of percentages, right? So I know that we all know what interest rates are, but I just want to simply lay it out there so that when you put the little I there, you know what the little I is. So the little I is the interest rate, and it's simply the rental cost of money expressed in percentage terms. One thing too I want to say about the interest rate, because it can't be lost on anybody that when we say the interest rate, one thing that might pop in your mind is, what do you mean the interest rate? As if there's only one interest rate. Yes, we're aware there's not only one interest rate, but there are different, and in fact, these differ wildly, which is one contributor to the overall volatility in this category. Is these things are all over the place, depending upon what kind of category of borrowing you're talking about. And there are all kinds of different credit grades by which borrowers are sort of segmented based on credit experience. And even in the commercial realm, I used to be a commercial lender. Not all borrowers are created the same. They all get different sorts of interest rates and fee structures and whatnot. And it's not always the case that borrowers, commercial corporate borrowers, can walk into a bank and borrow money at the prime rate, which is sort of a preferred rate. In fact, most do not. So the rates vary. It's usually some markup over that. So the interest rate is itself all over the place. And when the interest rate is going up, then it tends to be the case that investment will fall. And when the interest rate is falling, the investment spending will rise. And this looks a lot like a law of demand, doesn't it? And in fact, it sort of is. If investment is driven by the price of money, then the price of money is the interest rate. And so, but it's not expressed in dollars, it's expressed in percentage terms. But you can take those percentages and create dollars very easily. Interest rate times principal, and you get that kind of dollar figure. But the interest rate itself varies, and so investment spending will vary. And so as a result, this is very volatile. And if you consider the elements within investment spending, you can easily see that they're up, they're down, and why they're volatile. And I don't think you have to be an economist to understand that things like construction is not stable. Construction goes through booms and busts and booms and busts. And we see this happening all the time. Throughout the early part of the 2000s, there was just construction all over the place. You couldn't drive anywhere in the country without just seeing new homes going up, and lots of new homes, and trucks hauling drywall, and trucks moving cement, and workers building, and waking up at 6 in the morning, hearing automatic mailers going off everywhere. Yeah, I mean, it was that kind of thing. And then when the housing crisis hit, that kind of came to a screeching halt. And we know it's volatile. Commercial, it's the same with commercial construction. It has picked up since then, but it has not reached, in most cases, in most parts of the country, it hasn't reached the same levels. I'm talking about new construction of new structures. It hasn't reached that level that it had prior to the downturn. And it's a volatile part of it. The other part, fixed investment, which is equipment and machinery. If you're a business and you operate, you have lots of heavy machinery and whatnot, and maybe it's some of it's wearing out, and you think, well, maybe I don't want to do that because I'm going to have to borrow to do that, and maybe I don't want to pay a higher interest rate. Maybe I repair this machine and try to get another year out of it, or another 2 years, or whatever. Or I don't repair it at all. I just let it go, and we try to make do with what we've got. So there is discretion on the part of the demand side as to those particular sorts of items. And so, and I know that the company my dad, worked for a number of years, the owners were always reluctant to buy new equipment, and it was frustrating to him, but they were always trying to delay, just so they could hold out as long as possible until things were just absolutely desperate. And he thought that was a little short-sighted, but it is an illustration of what is very common, that is firms like to hold off on buying that stuff unless they absolutely have to. Okay. And then the final bit is inventories. That's a small part of the economy. It really is. The change is because it's the change in inventory. It's the change from one period to the next in inventories. It's usually not very large. But all of these together, though, are financed often by borrowing or by something which is tied to the interest rate. And for those of you who go on to take a finance course, you will see that there's something known as the cost of capital, which is not just the interest rate, because interest rates relate to borrowed funds, but there's also a percentage rate on any kind of capital that a business would raise. Even if it's ownership capital, owners want to be paid back somehow, often, even if it's in the future at some point. So there is a cost to those, the cost of funds to that. So as a result, these are all interest sensitive, these long-term investments in productive assets. Assets have to be financed somehow, whether it's through borrowing or through ownership capital or just earnings that are plowed back into the business, what are known as retained earnings. Okay, so that's very stable. This is very volatile, and I can't even give you a percentage of GDP because it goes all over the place. It's been as high as 20% of GDP. It's been in the single digits. It has, in rare instances, it's been a negative value when the change in inventories is absolutely just cratering, when businesses just absolutely trying to get rid of inventories. I think we had negative investment throughout the 1930s, not for the entire period, but for a brief stretch, simply because businesses just wanted to get rid of inventory, just get rid of it. It's not going to sell, let's get it gone, type of thing. And that particular case, it's a real case study in how a government should not manage an economic downturn. And we'll get a bit to that when we talk more about the policy piece. Okay, government spending is fairly stable. So in contrast to all of these, government spending is fairly stable. And one of the things about government spending is this, that it's the only part of this that is, for the most part, under the discretion of policymakers to sort of wave a wand over if they have the will to do it. What is challenging at times, and President Biden is certainly seeing this, and his predecessors had the same problems. So certainly President Obama did not get everything that he wanted, and what president does, because there's a Congress that they have to deal with. But when there's a will to spend, the government can spend money. And what is very interesting about the US economy and other modern economies, but particularly the US economy, is the fact that we can spend almost at will. And when we need to if we're spending more than what we're taking in, that is, the government's spending more dollars than what it's getting in the form of tax dollars, the government has a practically unlimited amount of capacity to just simply borrow it from the rest of the world, frankly. And I know there's a lot made of this idea of borrowing from foreign investors and whatnot, and that's a little bit exaggerated. I know that a lot of people are concerned that a lot of the buying up of our federal borrowings are by Chinese investors and by the Chinese government, that somehow they could wreck our system if they did that. I don't know why they would do that. That would be sort of suicidal, be cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. And it's not that large of a portion of foreign debt buying anyway. In fact, who really owns most of the US debt is the US government itself. And we'll see how this, it looks like maybe a little bit of a shell game where the Treasury borrows money from the rest of the world, but it ends up oftentimes ending up in the hands of the Federal Reserve, which is just another agency of government. And they do have an unlimited ability, absolutely unlimited, to create money just out of whole cloth. Because as we'll see, money is not backed by gold bars or gold or silver or anything. Yeah, they're just pieces of paper, and they're not even that so much anymore, really. Okay, so that's fairly stable. And then one thing about net exports is this, is that it may not be stable, but it's somewhat insignificant. It really is. And it's such a small component of overall demand in the economy that it's really not, did I spell that right? Insignificant. Can't tell if I spelled that right or not. It's somewhat insignificant. I don't want to say it's insignificant and therefore should be ignored, because I think that would be wrong to suggest that, but it's somewhat insignificant. And for a number of reasons. Number one, just beyond the obvious fact that whether this is a plus or whether this is a minus, it doesn't really make any difference because it's so small a contributor to GDP that it's probably not going to influence our economy one way or the other. That is, even if we double our imports of certain items, I don't know that it would really have that big of a drag on the economy. I mean, I just don't, and increasingly, I know that a lot of times people will look at oil, and right now, if you're looking at oil, the oil price is really skyrocketing. I checked this morning before I left the house, and it was over $90 a barrel, which that may not mean much to you if you're only looking at the gas pump, but that will come across at the retail level at some point. So, this is higher than it's been for some time. And it's by historical standards, we're sort of approaching, we're not at records yet, but it's getting there. But what I'm saying is from this context is, even if we double that, it probably would not have that significant impact on GDP overall. It would obviously have an impact on consumer spending, but I don't know that it would really raise the price of oil all that much, frankly. Okay, so it's fairly insignificant. So that's one reason why it's somewhat insignificant. The other is this: nobody's putting a gun to anyone's head and saying you've got to buy imports. There are a lot of imported items that we buy that makes our lives better because of our consumption of those goods. And so as a result, if we consume bananas or diamonds or coffee, things which we don't produce here, and I'm not sure what I would do without coffee, frankly. It makes our lives better, and the fact that we don't really produce it here means it's got to be imported. So despite the fact that every time we buy a cup of coffee, we're theoretically, well, I guess not theoretically, we are contributing to a little bit of a downtick in GDP. Well, I think that's worth the trade-off, for us to do that. So I think it's somewhat insignificant, both from a mathematical standpoint as well as from a quality of life standpoint. I think one more than balances out the other. Okay, and so I think that's good. Plus, the other thing too is if you're concerned about global economic development, and I know many people are, many just ordinary people, certainly many economists are, and that is the fact that we've got a very, very large portion of the human population that lives in much, much less advantaged conditions than what pretty much all of us in the US do. I mean, I'm serious. We're talking about people who don't have access to clean water, don't have access to electricity, no communications, no telephone, it's really dire circumstances. And one of the things that has been shown to be a potential roadmap out for those societies who want economic development is by trading with the rest of the world, by providing what it is that they can do best in order to trade with the rest of the world. And the economist Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize primarily for his work on economic development for developing countries, big advantage through international trade. And the success stories are there. It's not, I know we hear a lot of horror stories when it comes to developing countries and labor conditions and whatnot, and they're there, no question about it. Those are the reality. But look at the success stories of countries that were once on the list of impoverished countries, which today are doing very well. They include countries like South Korea. They include Indonesia, Singapore, Ireland, New Zealand, Egypt, Argentina. I mean, these are countries that are not without difficulties, but they're not in the impoverished conditions that they once were, even going back just a few decades ago. So within a generation or two, they've been able to improve their situations, mostly through concentrating on exports, trading to other countries. And so it is a roadmap out. I know it's not easy. I'm not saying that I've got some answer here. Just open this box and here's the answer. I know there are lots of significant challenges. There are issues with public health, transportation. There's a lot of civil strife in parts of the world. So it's somewhat difficult to say there's a one-size-fits-all solution. So taking all these together, GDP is relatively stable. Okay, so GDP itself is relatively stable, and that's the good news. Yes, we could draw these ups and downs of the business cycle. One of the things that we should really talk about, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, is if we plot a GDP on a time against a time series here, over time, what we're seeing happening is sort of a moderation of economic activity, lower highs, higher lows, bringing down some of the oscillation. And a lot of that is simply due to economic policy to be used to sort of stabilize this. So you don't have boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. That is not a good thing. And our experience has shown that over time, when we've had big booms, oftentimes they're followed by big busts. And we've seen this time and again, just in the last 20 or so years, where we've had big stock market booms that come to an end badly. We had a big housing boom that came to an end badly. And I'm not saying that it's not fun on the way up, but maybe a slower, more stable ride up is a better way to do it, because then you don't have the rocket ride down. Okay. All right. So questions for me about the expenditures approach before I move on. The income approach is going to go a little faster, and one of the reasons why it's going to go a bit faster is because I'm going to cut out a lot of the categories. And in fact, one of the things about this that makes it a bit unique is that there are so many categories in this and so many subcategories that you could have a list that literally goes on for page after page. There was a textbook that we used to use, most of us in our department, that had an inner flap and an outer flap on the cover that had a listing of all the items of GDP from the income approach, and it literally went on for like the both sides of the inner cover, and just because of the fact there was so much going on and there was a lot of detail. I'm going to cut out some of the detail just in order to sort of simplify things a little bit, because we're actually working our way down to some important categories here. So let's talk about the income approach. And I think by summarizing it, by cutting some things out, I don't think we lose a lot in the translation. I really don't. So let's say we start with GDP. And I know that your book will actually start with GNP. And for those of you who may have heard GNP before, I think we used to use that term pretty exclusively to refer to our national income or our total output of goods and services in the economy. The reason why GDP has sort of gained popularity, particularly in the last 30 years or so, is because of the fact that GNP would be the accounting for all income earned by all Americans everywhere. Okay, and it would take out income earned in America by foreign actors, foreign firms, foreign people. That's foreign workers, foreign firms. Well, there's so much economic activity now. There's so many American firms doing business elsewhere, and so many foreign firms and workers doing work here, that it really, what are we really trying to measure here? I mean, our tax authorities want to know that, because our U.S. tax code is designed around the idea that Americans pay tax on income wherever they earn it. Astronauts in outer space have to pay tax on their income, and I'm not exaggerating. That wherever an American earns income, they have to pay it. But beyond that, though, economists are more interested in what's done here, because we're talking about production of goods and services here, which translates to income here somewhere. And we are not particularly concerned about the nationality or the national origin of the firm or the worker or whomever, whatever the entity or the financial institution, whatever the entity is. We're mostly concerned with what goes on here. So GDP, the domestic part of that, is what is important. Okay, so we start with GDP. GNP is there. I mean, and we can simply, if we wanted to make the adjustment to GDP, and we do what's called net foreign factor income. When we say net, all we're doing is we're taking the difference between what's produced elsewhere by Americans. We would take that out of the GDP and we would add in, that is the foreign factor income, that is the income produced by foreign actors here, so that it would go into GDP. That calculation exists. I just want you to know that I'm not forgetting it, and I do know that your book gets into GNP, and so I felt it was important to talk about, mostly because, well, the text talked about it, and it's not that. It's not so much the thing that economists are concerned about. We're very much interested in the GDP aspect of it. Then we work our way down, and we're taking some things out. So anything in brackets or parentheses is a negative value. So and you'll see, whenever you see negative values, whether it's in finance or accounting or wherever, it's a negative. And so we have to take out what's called consumption of fixed capital. In the accounting world, that would be called depreciation, wouldn't it? And what's going on is this. The closest analogy I can think of is buying a new car. And we all know that if you buy a new car, the millisecond you drive it off the lot, it's already lost value. Not because, well, not so much because it's been banged up and dented up and whatever. I suppose that has happened, but it's the fact that it's no longer new, and so therefore it doesn't have the same characteristic. But think about this. That's just sort of a way of viewing this from our own experience. But all goods that are produced are immediately losing value all the time. And that includes things like real estate. And that sort of differs from I think some of our experience, because I think a lot of us believe that real estate just goes up in value over time. And we know that that is not always the case. Sometimes it deteriorates in value simply because it's wearing out. There's wear and tear on things that are fixed, what we would call fixed capital. That's the capital that goes back to the term capital in the factors of production model. So also known as depreciation. So then we arrive at what's called net domestic product, that is after consumption of fixed capital. Then we do something here where we're saying the GDP, or Y here, equals Y in the expenditures approach. Okay, in a $22 trillion economy, think about the difficulty in trying to trying to get these to match. It's like hitting a bullet with a bullet, right? It's very, very difficult to do, fast moving and a large space to cover. So what are the odds you're going to balance to the penny? Not very good. So here's how you do that. Can I help you? I'll be done here in about 20 minutes. So how do we do this? Well, I guess we sort of fudge the numbers a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. It's what's called a statistical discrepancy, which usually is a negative value, and that is the idea that some of these values are not balanced to the penny. Again, we don't have some giant supercomputer outside of Washington, D.C. that sort of calculates every time we buy gasoline or get paid or whatever. It just doesn't exist. Some of it is estimated. And in fact, the GDP numbers themselves are revised several times. And I don't think I talked about this, but I think your text might. We get and they're usually reported on a quarterly basis, okay? Quarterly every 3 months. And so right now we're in the first quarter of the year, and so we probably won't have a GDP number until sometime around the end of April, beginning of May. And it's usually on a particularly fixed date that everyone knows and is waiting for. And that's usually really an estimate, because it's not really completely clear, what's going on. There's a lot of estimate, there's a lot of data that's being observed, and so it's sort of an estimate. It's revised again a few months later, and it's revised yet a couple more times. The final revision usually happens once tax return data comes in. And one of the things about tax return data is it's considered to be very accurate. Particularly business returns are very accurate. Individual returns are also pretty accurate. I mean, contrary to what some might believe, that people are everyone's cheating on taxes. Everyone's not cheating on taxes. They really are not. And the reason being is that particularly for individuals, the opportunity to cheat is really limited because the IRS knows what you make because if you get a W-2, they get a copy of your W-2. If you get paid interest by a bank, they get a copy of that. So they wouldn't get what you've got as a side gig if you're playing in a band on the weekend or whatnot. They might not have that, but that's probably not going to tip the scales of GDP that much, even if all of us did something like that. So you have statistical discrepancy. All we're trying to do is reconcile the GDP from the income approach to the expenditures approach, and to make those numbers play. This is not a large number. We're not talking hundreds of billions of dollars at all. We're talking about a few $billion, which is a big number, but in an economy which is 20-some trillion, it's not that large, not that significant. Then we arrive at the value of national income. And when we talk about national income, here's what the important thing to know about this is that it goes back to, remember, this is the supply side of the economy, okay? And when we talk about the supply side, we're really talking about two actors here, and we go back once again to the circular flow model, right? That who is doing the producing? It's firms and households, right? That is firms producing goods and services, supplying them, in other words, and earning income to do it, otherwise they wouldn't do it, and households supplying labor to produce goods and services, earning income, or else they wouldn't do it. Well, how do households earn income? By providing goods and services. They provide their labor. To whom? To firms. So when we talk about the national income, this is really business income. This is business income. And even if you are self-employed, that still makes you a business, right? So if you're self-employed, that still makes you a business. Even if you're an Uber driver, you are a business. You're operating your own form of business. And if you don't know that, then you'll know that when it comes to tax time, when you have to do your taxes, because you will be treated as a business. And if you don't know that, the IRS will be more than glad to remind you of that. And so that makes you a business. So this is essentially business income. And so we come back to this idea that the value that's created in the economy, particularly a free market economy, a laissez-faire economy, is produced primarily by businesses. And that labor, it provides input to it. And there's a reason why that fourth category of entrepreneurial ability is there. It's the imagination and creativity that are brought by humans to the whole process. It sort of accounts for that sort of X factor. So the human element is not missing at all from this, okay? Despite the fact that national income is, from a very formal definition, of business income, okay? All right, so what are we taking out of this? Well, let's take out of this a couple of other things. And the first of these is going to be undistributed corporate profits. So given the fact that when we're talking about business income in the economy is dominated really by corporations, even though they're probably more sole proprietorships, that is individually owned small businesses and small partnerships. And there are numbers of corporations. The vast majority of the income that's being earned is corporate income. But it's not all distributed to people. In the accounting world, we would call that retained earnings. That is the idea that firms earn money, but it doesn't all get distributed to owners or to employees or to other suppliers and whatnot. And it doesn't always get sent off in the form of taxes. It sometimes is just simply reinvested into the business as retained earnings. And why we're doing this is because we're actually working our way down to the household level. And so we've now accounted for all income earned by firms, and we're working our way down to household. And so of those three actors in the circular flow model, all right, we're missing one, that's government. Well, government is picking up their action here in national income by corporate taxes, and they're going to pick it up through income taxes a little bit later on. We're talking about the federal level. States have their own particular way of raising income tax revenue. Both income taxes, and a bigger one in many instances is sales taxes. And very definitely in the states that don't have an income tax, sales taxes are where it pretty much all is, that and property taxes, okay? So we are accounting for all three actors here. Government is picking up its piece of the action at a lot of these different terms, certainly here with national income accounting, okay? Also, we take out Social Security contributions. And actually, we should probably say Social Security and Medicare contributions. And the term contributions here is sort of a misnomer because it's not really a contribution at all, it's a tax. And so contribution, you might think of, oh, it must be optional, it's a contribution. Well, no, it's not. Probably the better word is tax, but they're called contributions. And in fact, the act which created the Social Security system was known as the Federal Income Contribution Act, or FICA. And sometimes you might see FICA, FICA on your paycheck, which usually, and if it's that way, it usually combines Social Security and Medicare, or sometimes you'll see Social Security and Medicare withholding broken out separately on your paycheck. How that works is the fact that if you are a wage earner, you're as an employee, you pay a portion of your earnings to Social Security, and that is over and above any federal tax withholding, any state or local tax withholding, any other kinds of withholding you might have. Some of it goes to Social Security, so 6.2% of your earnings, up to, and it sort of ends as you earn whatever it is. It changes every year. They raise the limits. It's around, I think, around $140,000 per year, something like that, per worker. If you're self-employed, you pay the whole thing yourself because you are the employer. And then it's 1.45% on for Medicare, and that there is no limit on that if you're a worker. Those are also matched by an employer. So it's called contribution because you contribute as a worker, and so does the firm. And so, but who handles this is the firm. The firm basically takes out paychecks and just simply create an account of liability, and they forward it on to the government. So that comes out. Why this is important is because of the fact that this comes out, but then it comes back in later on when we get down to personal income. We do an add back here and talk about personal income. Personal income is this. Personal income is, let me just spell this out, because if you write it down, if you just write PI, you might look at your notes later and think, what the heck is PI? PI is personal income, and that is the portion of GDP that arrives at households pre-tax. So it's pre-tax household income is personal income. And it would include any kind of add back to Social Security. So we've taken it out and we add it back in. Taking it out and add it back in. You think, why are we doing that? Well, because not every household gets the add back. And by the way, even though there's all this discussion about, oh, Social Security is running out of money. Well, not really. I mean, yes, down the road, we're going to have to figure something out. And I talked a bit on Tuesday about the fact that they're already pushing back the limits for age requirements for recipients of the retirement piece of Social Security, not the death benefit for people with children, or the dependents benefit, or not the disability benefit, but the retirement benefit. So that's already been changing. But right now, the government's taking more out than what it's putting back into the economy through those distributions. But that could change over time as the population gets older. The point is that it goes back into personal income if you are getting it, and it's pre-tax. And some people do pay tax on Social Security. It just depends on your overall tax situation, without getting too deeply into those woods. So personal income, simply defined as pre-tax income, okay? Households. So we've accounted for the income approach, that is the supply side of the economy, those supplying value, firms, households, and the government is picking up its piece of the action through corporate taxes, through personal taxes. And I'm just going to carry this up here just because I'm out of room. And let's take out personal income taxes. Personal income taxes. Now, we are talking here about the federal level, and there are, depending upon the breakdown that you have, there are parts of this in which we have sales taxes, which tend to be state-driven, but there are federal sales taxes. Usually it's on certain goods like gasoline, tobacco, those kinds of goods primarily. But for the most part, they're there. I've simply cut those. I'm really focusing on the federal level here. So we've got on the circular flow model, we've got business firms, we've got households, and then we've got the taxation. This is where government picks up its piece of the action through personal income taxes. And what we're doing is we're working our way down to a very important figure here, which is called disposable income, or sometimes called disposable personal income, or DI. And disposable income is an important characteristic. We're going to be talking much more about disposable income and its importance throughout the economy. And it's going to be really one of the values that we'll start with in order to arrive at some models of how the economy works, and by starting with disposable income. So think about this. Disposable income is a very large portion of GDP. That is, I know that I have said this earlier, that we sometimes tend to think of the economy being dominated by big companies and corporations and whatnot. But in fact, a big portion of GDP actually arrives at the doorstep of individual households on an after-tax basis. So what disposable income really is after-tax household income of whatever form it is, okay? And I guess maybe one of the disadvantages of cutting out some of these categories here is that we don't get to see where we get the add back of Social Security and all that. I could have done that, but I mean, I think that's already busy enough. And my goal is not to drown you in what is already pretty dense anyway. But the point is that when we talk about after-tax household income, we're talking about disposable income, that there are really only two things that households can do with disposable income, and that is spend it and save it. Those are the only two things that a household can do after tax. Even if you were to make a charitable contribution, because that sometimes comes up as a question. Well, that's not really an act of consumption, is it? And we're going to say that yes, it is, because it doesn't meet the characteristic of savings. And so we talk about disposable income. What we're really talking about here is there are only two things that a household can do with it: spend it by creating consumption, or save it by creating savings. But the reason a charitable contribution is not savings is because we have a very definite definition of what savings is, and savings is what we would call deferred consumption. Deferred consumption, that is how a portion of income that is not spent but is instead pushed to some point in the future. That's what savings is. And then it's it also, one characteristic of this which defines savings really is that it tends to be deposited with financial intermediaries. And banks are the most obvious, but it doesn't have to be banks. It could be investment firms like any kind of investment firm like Merrill Lynch or E-Trade or whomever, or with an insurance company, insurance product like an annuity or anything like that, a mutual fund or exchange traded fund, something like that. They tend to be deposited with financial intermediaries, because if they're not, if somebody just takes savings, cashes their paycheck, and then every month puts $100 under their mattress or buried in a coffee can in the backyard, it's savings to them, but it's not savings to the economy because it's lost to the system. It's simply buried. And this was one of the difficulties that we had in this country with the Great Depression, was the fact that it was really attended by a collapse of the banking system, to the point where people really didn't trust banks. And why should they? Because so many people were losing their deposits. This is before deposit insurance. FDIC insurance existed. So why put your money in a bank? So as a result, people would simply bury the money somewhere in a coffee can or whatever, because it was safer than putting it into a bank, and it probably was in many cases. And I started in banking probably on the very tail end of a time in which people were starting to pass away who had engaged in that behavior for decades, even decades after FDIC insurance was around to absolutely insure their deposits, and that nobody ever lost money after that period once FDIC insurance was there, unless they were engaged with a bank that was engaged in some real sort of hicky things like the old Morse plan savings certificates that were not FDIC insured. That was, but that was just a rare exception. But people would pass away and their relatives would come in with sacks of cash. The grandma died, there was all this cash. And that's a problem because it didn't make its way into the economy. It's savings to them, but number one, it didn't earn them a return on their money. It didn't grow. They had the risk of it being destroyed or lost or stolen or whatever. But from a macro perspective, it was lost to the economy. It didn't exist to the economy. So With disposable income, consumption and savings, charitable contributions would be considered an act of consumption because it tends to be consumed fairly quickly, and it does not tend to end up simply as a long-term deposit with financial intermediaries. So disposable income includes all of these categories here. It would include things like wages and interest and rent, interest or dividends, which are earnings on stock holdings, rents, social security benefits, that is, pensions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any form of income, right? Royalties, if you wrote a book 20 years ago or whatever, all those go into that particular category of disposable income. And so we're going to pick this issue up a bit later, but I wanted to make sure that we worked our way down to disposable income so that we are simply saying, okay, of this giant pool of production, where does it all go? And this is sort of a description of where it all goes. Okay. All right. So I guess we'll push the unemployment piece next week. That's fine. That will not be very long and drawn out. But before we get there, I'll talk a bit more about some of the challenges with the GDP measure and why it's an imperfect measure at best. And then we'll talk about one of those issues is how we account for inflation, which erodes the value of all dollar-denominated values. And then we'll move our way into Chapter 8. So are there questions for me? Looks like we've lost a few people here, but our time is over. So feel free to get with me over the weekend if you have questions, and I'll be glad to help you. And otherwise, see you next time.